themselves behave and articulate their experiences in Brazil, but also when those experiences are articulated in space and in time, helps us to understand some of the larger experiences of those 750,000 and the many more Africans and Brazilians, native-born Brazilian slaves, and their experiences about freedom and enslavement. So I'm looking at two different things here. So just to get a sense about the two main sort of personal protagonists of this story here, the free Africans themselves and concessioners. These are, for the most part in the Brazilian case, it's not exclusive, but under the most part the Brazilian case, similar to the Cuban case, private citizens would petition for the services of liberated Africans. They were known as concessioners, concessionarios, or Humanities, and they would petition for these services to serve as their guardians during this period of apprenticeship that David mentioned earlier. Here's an image of a very, very prominent concessioner, the Marquesa do Paraná. She's one of many. I've been able to identify about 2,000 or so by name. And this is the only image I've ever found of a contemporary image of a free African, identified as a free African. There's one image here, unidentified emancipado from the Despachila, a ship that was apprehended in 1831. That was 48 Africans. The story of the free African has been told in various ways in contemporary scholarship, but it's a question of history already in the period of enslavement itself, the slave trade. William Dougall Christie, the British minister, a very cantankerous person, among other things, writes very much about the free African story in Notes on Brazilian Questions, but he's one of several different authors, including some Brazilian authors, who talk about the problem of free Africans in the 19th century. Now, how do we visualize time and space in the experiences of free Africans is a big question that I've been asking, and then in dialogue with my colleagues at the Social History Lab here. So first I want to go back to the map we're already familiar with. We've seen this map not just here, but many different ways and many different times. And one of the things I just want to point out that this map does is it does visualize time and space. What it does is it collapses or it aggregates all time of the transatlantic slave trade into one image. And it also does space here, principally on that voyage, or those voyages, or the flows from the African continent to the Americas. So the visualization of time and space is a pretty common and familiar language in which to talk about the experiences of enslavement and the trade. One of the things, though, that Daniel's work and my work and many other people's work is trying to do, though, is to complicate this and enrich visual time and space by looking at both the continental African experiences and the American experiences over space and time. So using our sources that we already have that go into some of the things about the maps like this, and new sources to try to find out more, explore this in more detail. Of course, beginning with the Transatlantic Slave Database, which is a phenomenal tool, among others, to do this. It has lots of information which is very relevant to time and space. But also to go beyond that by using other technologies which were not part of the original transatlantic slave trade database, particularly GIS. And so with the support of the National Endowment for the Humanities and the work at the Spatial History Lab at Stanford, we worked on this Broken Paths of Freedom. And the map behind this is going to be featured in a second here. Spatial history, for those of you who are not familiar with the term, or at least not familiar with the way in which it sort of works at Stanford, this is one way of, it's articulated by the founding director of the Spatial History Lab, Richard White, who works on many things, including the West here, but particularly looking at visualizations, which is a very important both method and a tool and an object for spatial history, and other ways of producing visual evidence as a form of research, and not really only to illustrate. And one of the things he really stresses in there is about how visualization, spatial history is a form of research to tell stories about the past. And that's one of the key challenges, but also one of the key possibilities for my own work here. This pilot project I've selected, and I can tell the background story, but just basically the pilot project was to look at one slave ship. The César, which was embarked, has not just a history that's parallel to the Barianchi, that actually has a history that directly intersects with the Barianchi, but is embarked in Ambaris, northern Angola, like the Barianchi, in 1838, early 1838. The disputed number, about 260 is a high number, a low number is about 190 Africans were embarked, and it was seized off the coast of Rio province, just like Barianchi, about a month before the Liberated by a British cruiser, and was brought into Rio port. Adjudicated, a very long process of adjudication. There were attempts to kidnap, disease, among other things, lots of problems, but eventually 211 Africans were liberated in July of 1838. All those who survived, and this is a minority, but nonetheless many survived, were received their second emancipation in 1865, along with all the remaining Africans, liberated Africans of Brazil. This image here is an image of the type of ship, the Cesar. I've never seen an image of the actual ship. It's so kind of fashion. The transatlantic safe trade database is, as I said, a rich tool here. And here's the entry for it. Let's come back here. I just want to point to this top here, the 1723. The assignment of a unique identifier is one of the big challenges that we have in this project. So I just want to sort of point your attention to that and come back to that. But how do we go beyond, and actually I just want back here. I also want to say that the transatlantic safe database also uses visualizations in a certain degree, in this case points of embarkation in Africa, disembarkation, or the end of the voyage in the Americas. But how can we go beyond that, both in the case of understanding the experiences of those who end up on the ship in the African context, but then what happens once they're disembarked in the American context. And so how do you do that? So lots of different source materials here, these nominal lists, as I mentioned, and Danielle's already showed us one from the Liberated. In this case, what it says are, like the Liberated actually, there are several different nominal lists which are taken at various times, and they record name and nation and body markings and age. Don't necessarily record it consistently or in a uniform manner, but nonetheless they do. So this particular list here, and I just put this together just now, the list that you're working with, the African names, was done 2 days after this list. So it's very clear when we talk about the scribes and the interpreters. Cosmeli is the interpreter, I can't remember who the scribe is, are going back and forth onto these ships and doing, because the two ships are actually anchored together in port. And they're going and they're doing a whole bunch of things. So I would think that one of the reasons why the Liberated list is taken in June 23rd is because it's related to the Cesar's list, which is actually this is the more formal list, which is done on the 21st. Just put that together. But there are other lists which done this Cesar done in 1864, which include concessioners and last known fate. I'll come back to that. Lists done in 1845, 1816, 1865 of concessioners, the Africans associated with them, addresses, wages, and another list which was done in 1864, which I discovered in part of a legal case because the one guy wanted to be paid for the work he did. Another list for the Cesar, which included names and nation and final fate, and then a range of other materials. The letters of emancipation. In these cases, this is one for Albina, who dies, and her letter of emancipation, which is on the front, and is also her death certificate. So the reverse of it lists out the conditions of her death and the address of her concession at the time of her death. Petitions submitted by potential concessioners. When the Liberated and the Cesar are in port together, there's this kind of there's some advertisements in the papers to say, basically, if you'd like to ask for the concession of these Africans' labor, please submit your materials to the judge. And I found about almost 200 petitions submitted by various private individuals who are seeking the labor concession, and they declare in various ways why they're meritorious of this. Many of them, not all, many of them also include addresses of where the petitioners resided and where they would like to employ the Africans. And then other kinds of materials done later in the Africans' experience in Brazil, particularly in Rio, attesting to a whole range of things, problems, issues, complaints, in this case seeking second emancipation, but attestation is a series of their good behavior and time of service. And then the person who originally brought me to this entire story here, Eladio Congo, who was a boy, Cesar in 1977, who petitions for his freedom, second emancipation twice, but also in the case, in this, he gets mixed up and he's with the British consul, and his particular case rises to the level of major correspondence between the British foreign minister and the Brazilian foreign minister and minister of justice, in which they debate the nature of freedom itself and argue about what freedom means. based on his particular, Hilario Congo begins with Hilario Congo's audience with the British minister. So all this together, all these different kinds of materials required not just transcriptions, but then a lot of questions about how to create a database that then could be visualized. So a lot of work went into transcribing, but then trying to reconcile names of nations, concessioners' names, and addresses, and great amount of variety. Incomplete, contradictory information, and this is just for one ship. And I have information for about 9,000 Africans. We've done this for about 9,000 Africans and about 2,000 concessioners. And it says there's about 211 Africans and about 140 concessioners. So it's a big project here, but a lot of information had to be reconciled, and some arbitrary decisions made about how to spell a name, how to standardize a nation, what to do with addresses that weren't standardized. Some addresses are very clear. It's a particular street address. Now it's at the corner of, it's near the quarry, how to standardize those and then plot those in GIS. But in that, all that being said, created, this is just a sample of the database. This is an Excel, not very exciting, but the fundamental basis of both digital humanities is an Excel database, Excel spreadsheet that has a range of information in it from the standardized. So how to visualize time and space. So one aspect of visualizing time is to create something very familiar to us, seeing pre-ArcGIS, a pie chart. And this particularly captures a moment in 1864 in which the registries try to capture the last known fate, which was, of the free Africans of the Cesar. So to take that information, create proportions, and create a pie chart. So this is one kind of familiar way to us. Not terribly interesting, but it does give us a way to already understand that a good portion of the free Africans by 1864 were dead. There's also a very large number of conflicting records and unresolved cases. Simply, Brazilian authorities at this point did not know what happened in 1864. And the number of fled and those who received their emancipation. Other ways to do this, and this was the first time we did this one. I will fess up right here. Everyone, including me, agrees that this was not a successful visualization. However, I will put it up here because the idea was how to visualize, in this case, time, a timeline. And so why this was, it is successful in that it begins in 1838 and ends in 1865, and it maps out the various episodes, events, death, emancipation, fled. What it doesn't do, or what it does here, which is very difficult for anyone to understand, is it seems to suggest flow, some sort of volume. And what really the heights are is just, that's corresponding to the matricula numbers here. So that's why it's not successful, because it leads you to some wrong conclusions about something happened in 1845. Okay, it's just that this person here, which we can find out, probably has a number of 208 died. Okay? But this is another way to the experience of time over time. And one of the things we see, obviously, the major experience for the free Africans at the beginning is death. Very large concentration of death. The first emancipations come only in 1853 or end of 1854, beginning of 1854, when there's a change in legislation. And then a very large number of emancipations and relatively few deaths near the end of the period. How to visualize space. Again, we begin with something familiar, a map. Very conventional map, a historical map here. This was a map done in 1867. But one of the problems, of course, is what map do you choose to begin to map at a period of time? Just for the Cesar, we have a 30-year period in Rio. How to map that in the city itself, which is changing. The city itself, the structure of the city changes. In particular, I just want to point our attentions to this here. We point our attentions here to this area, Cidade Nova, here in 1867, which looks relatively urbanized now, and there's streets and stuff like that. We actually go to an earlier map, in 1831, so the beginning of my period here. By chance, I have two maps, which are almost exactly the period here. This period, this region here, Cidade Nova, here's Constantão, is not developed. It was mainly swampland. The transformation of that region of the city was in part done with the labor of free Africans. So how then to capture in these two maps the actual presence of the free Africans, of the Cesar and other ships, actually changes the city. How to visualize that then spatially, and how to capture the changing spatial environment as well as the experience of the temporal environment. So that's one of the challenges. So this is where, the fun part, I hope this works right now, is creating a visualization tool, which is based on a pre-existing tool that was already developed at the Spatial History Lab around 19th century Rio, which required a significant and very long period of georectification and a whole bunch of plotting so that one can now type in on this historical address locator. You can type in an address from 19th century Rio, and it'll show you where that address is, as if you're using Google Maps today and you want to know what an address is in New York City. It will show you to that specific plot level, street level. So using that tool and then adapting it, looking to the experience of the Cesar, and for some comparative, Liberated. These two ships which have very shared experiences and have given us a total of about 465 Africans and 300 concessioners or so over urban space. So because this is really showing more about what the tool does and less some analysis right here, I always just like to just show an easy one, Maria, because there's so many Marias. So by typing in Maria, drawing on these 450 African names, give you any text string that has the word Maria, so also includes Mariana, Mariano, the nation, the ship, and the numero de matrícula, the number assigned to the African at the moment in which they're liberated. Then if one, so this just kind of pulls that all in. Then one, you sort of mouse over this, then it begins to show all known addresses, in an attempt to show, in this particular case, movement over time. So from movement over time. So this is just some basic things. This does allow, as I mentioned, about changing space over time. You can select or deselect the street grid as it existed in 1831, at the end in 1865. Other kinds of features, just give some wayfinders. And then also, this is a pre-existing tool around property rents to give you a sense about space in relationship to wealth. I'll turn it off. So these are very kind of layers that have been put in, and then parish boundaries, which I don't think are so much. The other is to go from concessioners, and I'll still go with my all concessioners. Again, any concessioner with the name Maria or the text string Maria are listed here. And then this is the part, unfortunately, because the designer is on maternity leave, he hasn't connected the two here, but one would not just be able to see where all the addresses associated with that particular concessioner is, but also by clicking on it, which isn't working, it would be up here. It would give you a box in which you'd see all the Africans associated with that person. So be able to link concessioners and Africans in space and in time. So this is the kind of the big tool that we have for use. One of the products of this tool includes some things about, I already showed you some basic ones about layers, but others about filtering. So a range of filter data. Data can be filtered out by gender, by nation, by last known fate, by concessioner type, to begin to more closely refine search criteria to query the database, the data, around a range of interest questions that you might have about what is the experience of gender and what is the experience of gender and public established concessioner type, and then compare that on the Cesar. How do you compare that against the Brianche? How do you compare that against the experience of children, girls, for instance? Begin to ask how space and time are conditioned by certain kinds of categories, other kinds of categories, and how those categories help to understand space and time over time. And then, let's go out here. So you've seen the basic tool. We can go back and talk about some of these problems of the tool that still exist and also its potential. These are some static visualizations just to capture, and these are some earlier ones. The tool is more sophisticated than this. But it begins already with just really basic. Let's just look at gender. All spaces associated with men and women, or males and females, that includes boys and girls. And you begin on this pattern here to already see here that, this is of Africans, that pretty much is not just Africans are distributed throughout the city, but there's a gender distribution that is, it has certain kinds of patterns of concentration, but it's fairly concentrated. But when we look at concessioners, on the other hand, the right-hand one, the number of women is smaller, but also their geographic distribution is more to the outskirts of the city, away from various kinds of commercial centers, which are particularly this area in the city. So you obviously have to know some things about the urban geography here. This is just a really basic one we did, just to show a kind of static visualization here, which would be done, which could also be done dynamically through the visualization tool. Others related to time and space of emancipation. So this map, again, this was an early one of the Cesar, all known addresses, the last known address for the time of emancipation for that. So, and it's done by time here, so there's actually time and space here. But when we actually go into the street level, we begin to see certain kinds of patterns, which suggest, in this particular case, this is Lapa, and Rio, the Paseo Público's here, this is Paseo, Bays right over here. There's a certain concentration of emancipation. And when you're able to then put those together with other kinds of data, begin to understand the possibility for understanding networks among Africans who are in different households, using different occupations, but not who arrive on the same ship, so they may have maintained their context, but also are strategizing in similar ways to change or to alter or to condition their life circumstance, in this case, toward second emancipation in 1855. So again, the tool allows for that kind of detail. Including here, many challenges. We have this numbers game. Just for the Cesar, I have anywhere from 191 to 260 Africans from different, this is just the Cesar. So how many are we talking about? And then and make any sort of question about, as you presented us today, about percentages, ratios. What is our absolute number to compare anything against is very, very difficult. And this is for one pretty well-documented ship. There are other ships which have documentation is more uneven. The unique identifiers. I suggested that the slave trade database did a wonderful job of doing this for the ship voyages, which is wonderful. But how do we assign unique identifiers to Africans? The part of the process of liberation does assign numbers, which we're using, but how do we do this for concessioners, private individuals? And in part we say, well, why does it matter? Because in a database, basically to make sure that you know that you're talking about the same person every time you need a unique identifier. João, we saw how many Marias in there? There are many Maria Suarez. How we know every time we're talking about this Maria Suarez and not another Maria Suarez. So unique identifiers are really important here, but how to create a system which is both arbitrary, consistent, but also transparent. It's been a big challenge. The relational databases, how to put these all together in a larger database. And then a great deal of discussion when you don't have any particular solutions is how to visualize uncertainty and conflicting evidence, of which there's a tremendous amount. Visualizing off the map. I've shown just materials on Rio, but even on the Cesar, there are many who are in the larger Rio area, Niterói, across the bay, in the Guarachiba, sort of down south of, but off this particular map, which has already been geocodified. And then there's some in Minas and other places. How do you visualize off of a map in ways that is meaningful for this great detail now? Has been a challenge. And then, of course, we think about the other free Africans in Sao Paulo or in Bahia, among other things. And then from the fragmentary evidence that is sometimes suggested can be placed together to create threads, narrative threads, but how to tell stories that somehow still are based on fragments. And I use the case of Hilario Congo, which I said was the kind of the figure I introduced me to this. I know a decent amount about Hilario Congo, but I still do not know what his African name is, and I will never know. I do not know, even though in a particular case he makes a very strong case for why he should receive his emancipation and his wages. I have no idea what his effective life was like. Not documented. I have that kind of information for other free Africans. They want to marry, they have kids. Women in particular are fighting for the freedom of their kids, not for his kids. So it's a fragmentary story. But particularly how to tell that, how to then, out of those fragments, make narratives that are coherent, and compelling, somewhat following certain biographical rules, and this is a particularly, I think it's consistent with the way, if you're familiar with some of the relaying documentation, this auto-narrative of an free African's life is this kind of baseline for the petition for second emancipation. I was enslaved on this ship and I was liberated, and this is my number. But how to work with that, the fragments of that, but also, of course, how to tell larger narratives, which are not about individuals per se, but about larger historical structures and processes as well. And I guess the last slide is, kind of scaling up here, some of the other elements, the way in which it can be done in relation to other digital history projects. Particularly though the numbers, the larger numbers, just not one ship. And then I guess the last one, is to place, I don't know why I did that, sorry. And to place kind of free Africans, in particular space here, in relationship to the many other spaces which exist within slave societies in the history of enslavement that are constantly at tension, whether it's free soil or free wombs or these other spatialized places that are constitutive of freedom, but also constitutive of enslavement. And the relationship between those two help us, one of the ways to kind of enter into the larger arc, as David suggested here at the beginning. Slavery exists everywhere in the 19th century, at the beginning, and in Brazil including, and the end of the 19th century in the Americas. It exists nowhere. How does that happen?